Hello everybody, in today's video we're going to be discussing Slowbalisation, otherwise known as De-Globalisation in under 12 minutes. Let's begin with an introduction to Slowbalisation. But first, before defining what Slowbalisation is, we must first identify what globalisation is, as Slowbalisation is just the slowing of globalisation. So, globalisation describes the increased integration and interconnectivity of different nations across borders through a process of regional economic integration. Now, this is a concept we've covered previously, and I'm going to attach a link to that video here now on screen. So, if that is what globalisation is, then Slowbalisation describes the deceleration or the slowing of globalisation in international business. Some practical examples of Slowbalisation are Brexit, where Britain withdrew from the European Union, the decoupling of US and Chinese trade, and the increased popularity of anti-globalism within Europe and Africa. So, what does Slowbalisation look like? Well, as you can see here on this graph, the world exports as a percentage of GDP has decreased within recent years. You can see that there was a peak in 2007, and since then it has decreased to around 29% in 2020, and I think now it's at around 27%. So ultimately, the exportation between countries is becoming increasingly less important, and as a result represents a lower percentage of the global GDP. Also, global foreign direct investment has also decreased drastically since the 2008 financial crisis. This is because investors are reluctant to engage in foreign direct investment as it poses increased risks due to the volatility of foreign markets. And once again, this is the last example. You can see here that countries have begun to take measures to reduce their openness to trade with other countries. You can see that trade openness has been decreasing since around 2018, entering in and ushering in the period of Slowbalisation which we are currently experiencing. So, what are the drivers of Slowbalisation? Well, firstly, there are nationalistic sentiments whereby people residing in their own countries feel as though there is a loss of national culture, identity, and sovereignty. There are also technology improvements which are reducing the need for foreign low-cost labour offshoring because manufacturing can remain domestic. There is also increased regional economic integration, which is lessening the total international integration. For example, the USMCA has reduced North American trade with Asia as the US has begun trading increasingly with its neighbours, Mexico and Canada. Or you can look at the EU. Once the EU was ushered in, European countries began reducing their trade with Africa and focusing instead on other European countries. Another reason could be social trends. For example, concerns about carbon emissions and thus wanting to source products locally. Or there could just be a preference for locally sourced goods. Many people in the UK, for example, only buy British sourced produce, such as milk, bread, and those sorts of things. And these are just social trends that change over time, and these social trends are currently leaning towards a decrease in globalisation. There could also be an increased international supply chain vulnerability, as this was highlighted by COVID, when international supply chains came to a halt and many multinational enterprises had to close. As a result, there is now an increased importance on having localized and domestic supply chains. Another reason could be the increased trade tensions and protectionism, which is resulting in heightened tariffs and trade barriers between countries. And lastly, there are issues in global governance and undemocratically elected leaders. For example, the European Union just voted to enact a new phone charging standard across all European countries, despite there being no vote on this from the countries themselves, and it has really disgruntled many people within Europe. Now, these are the main drivers of slowbalisation. However, slowbalisation does pose some threats. Now, these threats are posed against businesses, nations, and people, as these are the key stakeholders within globalisation and slowbalisation. For businesses, there is a shift from internationalized to localized supply chains. Now, the threat here is the increased cost required for operating with localized supply chains, especially if businesses have grown with economies of scale and are leveraging these to lower prices. There is also an increased difficulty in accessing foreign markets, as decreases in globalization result in heightened trade barriers, as mentioned previously. And lastly, there are problems in recruiting and retaining skilled foreign workers. Now, this is a problem currently being experienced within the UK, as we have withdrawn from the European Union, and as such it is increasingly difficult to find skilled workers to fill the open positions within the UK. Now, for nations, there is the threat of an economic slowdown, and this is because when a nation remains entirely domestic, it is limited to the amount of trade in which it can stimulate, essentially. For instance, Britain was the most wealthy during the times of the British Empire, when it was incredibly globalized. This is because it could leverage the resources of a variety of different countries rather than relying on those that are domestically produced. Also, for nations, there are threats of isolationism and economic resource dependence. For example, this entails countries that have isolated themselves from the outside world and then become dependent upon their own natural resources, such as Venezuela or Russia and their dependence upon oil. And the final threats posed by slowbalisation are for people. For people, slowbalisation can mean higher prices, as oftentimes, particularly in developed countries, the costs of producing locally far surpass those of producing internationally. And it could also result in a reduced product or service choice. This is because exporting into these markets becomes more difficult. People may also face cultural isolation, and lastly, challenges in education involving the movement of students, and also challenges in healthcare. For instance, during the COVID pandemic, even though the globalized nature of the world arguably heightened the severity of COVID, the international healthcare response and the collaboration which came out of globalization was one of the key reasons why COVID ended so quickly. So there are some threats posed by slowbalisation. But it's not all doom and gloom for slowbalisation, as many opportunities are presented for businesses, nations, and people. For businesses, there are opportunities such as increased popularity due to nationalistic sentiments, more resilient supply chains as M&Es, localized suppliers, thus reducing the amount of risk within the supply chain, because entirely domestic chains only face uncertainty within one country rather than multiple, and an increased supply chain awareness and transparency, as local supply chains are easier to monitor. Whereas for nations, there are opportunities within increased self-sufficiency, as suppliers in other countries begin to be replaced by domestic substitutes, resulting in new industry and newfound self-sufficiency. Increased national sovereignty, and thus policies that better reflect the needs of the country and its citizens. And lastly, decreased migration, resulting in heightened national homogeneity and increased cultural preservation, which is becoming increasingly important for many nations, particularly those within Europe. And the final opportunities are for people, concerning areas such as new employment opportunities in sectors that were once internationalized, such as agriculture or manufacturing, enhanced community interconnectivity through local trade revitalization rather than independence, and lastly, greater product ethicality, as domestic supply chains and production processes are almost guaranteed to be more ethical than their obscured international counterparts. So, to summarize, Slowbalisation essentially describes the deceleration of globalization, hence the nickname De-Globalisation. Practical examples have been discussed, such as Brexit and the slowing global foreign direct investments worldwide. Slowbalisation is driven by a variety of factors, such as social trends, whether these be nationalistic or environmentalist sentiments, technology improvements, or even heightened trade tensions and protectionism. However, Slowbalisation presents several social, economic, political, and performance-based threats and opportunities for businesses, nations, and people. Thank you very much for listening. That is all for today's video. And if you tune in next time, we will be discussing how to perform a SWOT analysis and what a SWOT analysis is. So we'll see you then. Thank you very much for watching, and please remember to like and subscribe because it helps the channel out a whole lot. Thank you.